Admiral Rennar stood motionless in the darkened observation room, his gaze fixed on the screen before him. The simulation chamber below hummed with the low buzz of machinery as the human child took their place at the controls. The child was small, no older than 12 by Coran standards, far too young to command a vessel of any kind, let alone engage in a virtual battle against simulated fleets of enemies, far superior in both technology and strategy. But there the child was, undeterred, eyes wide, with determination, hands steady as they gripped the controls, their fingers flying across the interface with a skill that left Rennar wondering if this was simply a fluke, a one-off display of unearned confidence, or something more. He had seen humans before, but never one like this. Their race was known for their resilience, for their ability to adapt and survive. But no one had ever suggested they could master the complex art of warfare so quickly, yet this child displayed a natural understanding of tactics and battlefield maneuvers, as if they had been born for it. Every move was deliberate, and each choice seemed to come from instinct, not taught or programmed, but drawn from some deep well of understanding that Rennar couldn't quite place. It was as if the child was seeing the battle before it unfolded, reacting with a kind of sharp foresight that normally took years of experience to develop. The virtual battlefield around the child's avatar exploded with bright flashes and twisting debris. Rennar saw the child's ship dance through the chaos, avoiding incoming fire with a grace that would have impressed even the most experienced combat pilot. The child's eyes flickered across the screen, calculating angles and trajectories with the precision of a seasoned strategist, while Rennar's own experts struggled to analyze the data in real time. The human's responses were impossible to predict but effective. Each move made was followed by a chain of perfectly executed actions that led to a series of decisive victories over enemy fleets. Rennar's interest deepened, his mind raced as he tried to process what he was witnessing. Was this the result of human ingenuity, or had something deeper taken root within their species? This wasn't just random chance. No, this child was operating on a level far beyond what the Admiral had been led to believe about humanity. For all their flaws and limitations, the humans seemed to possess something more, a raw and unrefined brilliance that allowed them to see patterns where others saw chaos. The Admiral's gaze narrowed, and he leaned forward slightly. What was it about this child that was different? The simulation intensified, and the child's avatar navigated through an asteroid field. While under fire from enemy ships, their movements were calculated like the sweep of a chess master, anticipating each strike before it came, avoiding destruction with perfect timing. Rennar's breath caught for a moment. The skill displayed was unlike anything he had encountered before in any species. His people, the Corin, had conquered countless systems, had outwitted and outlasted many enemies, but none had ever displayed this level of adaptability. Was this just one exceptional child, or was it the beginning of something larger, something? Rennar wasn't prepared for the question gnawed at him as he watched the child pilot their ship to victory against impossible odds, and he couldn't help but feel the tiniest stir of unease deep within him. The child finished the final simulation with a perfect score, and Rennar sat back in his chair, wondering if the galaxy had just witnessed the dawn of something new, something that could change everything. Rennar couldn't shake the unease that had settled in his chest. The child's performance was not a coincidence. It was something more, something that he could not fully understand yet, but knew he would have to if the Corin were to survive the future. In that moment, he signaled to his chief technician to run an in-depth analysis of the simulation data. Each move, each calculation needed to be broken down and examined. No stone could be left unturned. His instincts told him this child represented something far beyond what his people had considered possible. As the technician worked to feed the raw data into the fleet's central intelligence systems, Rennar replayed the simulation in his mind. Every step of the battle, the child had fought through every twist and turn of the conflict seemed to align perfectly, as if the child had been able to foresee what was coming next, not just react, but anticipate it with an uncanny precision that made no sense. Rennar had seen veterans in action, and even they couldn't match the natural flow this child had displayed. The technician's voice cut through the stillness of the observation room with a soft beep, confirming that the data was ready to be analyzed. The numbers began flooding across the screen like a cascade of symbols and charts, But what struck Renard was the speed at which the child adapted to changing circumstances. There were no simple patterns here. The child had anticipated every movement of the enemy ship in a way that should have been impossible for one so young. Every evasive maneuver was perfectly timed. Every offensive strike landed with deadly accuracy. Renard's mind raced with questions. Who was this child? How could they have developed this level of skill and tactical foresight at such an early age? And why was it so different from what he had seen from the human race? So far, his people had observed the humans for years and had always seen them as a species of instinct and emotion, capable of quick thinking and bravery. But this child was showing a depth of calculation that the Corin had not encountered before. It was as if they could read the battlefield and predict outcomes before they even occurred. What worried Renard more was the realization that this child was not an isolated case. In fact, it seemed as though this instinctual brilliance was part of something larger, a pattern forming within humanity that was both fascinating and terrifying. He had seen it before in the history of other species. Those who adapted too quickly and too effectively often became a force to be reckoned with, and in some cases, a force that could challenge the established order. The Admiral stood from his seat and began pacing the observation room as the data continued to stream across the screens. The technician had started to compare the child's movements to the Corin's own battle strategies, and the results were surprising. It seemed as though the child had unconsciously created an entirely new approach to combat, one that was unorthodox, but incredibly effective, a style that the Corin had never considered and could not predict. A sense of dread began to settle over Renard. It was as if the universe itself was warning him that humanity was evolving in ways no one had imagined, and the Admiral could not help but wonder what this meant for the future. If a child could make such an impact on the battlefield, what would humanity as a whole be capable of when they matured into their full potential? He couldn't ignore the feeling that he was witnessing the first signs of something that could change the entire balance of power in the galaxy, and as the final simulation data was processed, the only thought that kept circling in Renard's mind was simple and unnerving. If this is what a child could do, what would humanity be capable of in the wars to come? As the hours passed, Renard found himself unable to look away from the data on the screen. The child's simulation results were being broken down and reconstructed by the fleet's AI. But every new analysis only deepened the Admiral's concern. At first, he had thought this was simply an anomaly, but now it seemed increasingly clear that the child was an outlier in a much larger trend. What had started as an interesting curiosity was rapidly evolving into something much more profound. Renard replayed the simulation over and over again, examining the child's every decision. There was no mistake, no miscalculation. Every action was purposeful and connected to a larger goal. The child's tactical decisions defied the conventional wisdom of warfare that Renard had come to know over decades of command. As he watched, he couldn't help but wonder what humanity had tapped into, what secret of the universe had allowed them to craft such strategies seemingly without effort. And if this was possible for one child, what was the true extent of humanity's untapped potential? As the fleet's intelligence systems continued to analyze the data, new patterns emerged. The child's strategies were not merely reactive, they were anticipatory and proactive. The child didn't just fight the battle, they shaped it. They changed the flow of events, as if the simulation were a canvas, and the child was painting with strokes of genius. The child had created entire new approaches to combat, mixing offense and defense in a way that was unpredictable yet devastatingly effective. The complexity of the child's strategies struck Renard with a deeper realization. This was not just talent or luck, it was something intrinsic to humanity as a species. This kind of thinking was not born of years of training or experience, it was innate. It was as if the humans possessed an instinct for war, a primal force that drove them to adapt, to overcome. The child had simply unlocked it earlier than others, and once unlocked, it was something that couldn't be ignored. Renard felt a growing sense of urgency as he recognized what this meant for his people and for the galaxy at large. If humanity's natural combat instincts were so potent. How long before their species began to perfect them? How long before the child's brilliance became the norm rather than the exception? Humanity was not just a race to be tolerated or even feared. They were evolving into something entirely different, a species that could outthink, outmaneuver, and outlast anyone who stood in their way. The Admiral called for a report from his senior officers. He needed to discuss the situation with them before word of the child's performance spread across the fleet. But even as he prepared to gather his thoughts, he found his mind wandering back to the simulation. Was it truly just a game to the child? Or was it something more? Had the child known on some level that they were not just playing but preparing for something larger, a future that Renar was not yet ready to face? His officers arrived quickly, their expressions grave, as they took their seats around the conference table. But Renar was not ready to speak yet, not until he had gathered his thoughts. He leaned back in his chair and stared at the view screen, his mind racing with possibilities. The child's performance had shattered his previous understanding of humanity, but it was only the beginning. What would happen when more children like this one began to surface? The future was unfolding before him, and Renar couldn't help but feel as though the galaxy was about to be forever changed. The silence in the conference room grew heavy as Renar stared at his officers. None of them spoke, yet all of them sensed the gravity of the situation. They had gathered to discuss a single child, a human child, and yet it was clear that the Admiral's mind was far beyond just one simulation. The data presented was undeniable, and Renar knew the galaxy was changing faster than any of them could predict. Renar broke the silence, first his voice measured but full of a rare urgency. The child who played the simulation has shown us something new, something no species has ever demonstrated before. Humanity is not just a resilient race. They possess an adaptability and creativity that could reshape everything we know. This is no longer an isolated event. The room remained still, but Renar could see the flicker of recognition in their eyes. The pieces were falling into place. The child's performance was not a fluke, nor was it just the result of superior programming. The child had unlocked something fundamental, a deeper understanding of combat that transcended any learned skill. It was as if the child could think 3 steps ahead, seeing the battlefield unfold before it happened. Renar continued as he stood from his chair, pacing slowly, his thoughts racing. We have underestimated humanity. We believe them to be mere survivors, but now I see that they are capable of much more. They are evolving at an alarming rate, and if we do not prepare for this evolution, the Quarren may find themselves at a disadvantage sooner than we think. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, and one of the commanders, a seasoned warrior named Theric, spoke up. But Admiral, humanity is still primitive in many ways. Their technology lags behind ours, and their fleets are small compared to ours. How could one child's skill change anything? Renar paused and turned his gaze on Theric, his expression calm, but filled with a quiet intensity. It's not the technology that concerns me, it's the human mind, the instinctual brilliance we saw in that child that will make them a threat to us and to every other species in the galaxy. Their capacity for innovation and tactical thinking is unlike any I've seen. We cannot afford to view them as simply another race to conquer. Their potential is beyond what we expected. The room fell silent once more, and Renar could feel the weight of his words sink in. The officers were not used to hearing such caution from him. They were trained to face any challenge head-on, to conquer and defeat without hesitation. But this was different. This was not a foe that could be simply fought and defeated. Humanity's approach to warfare was something else entirely, something that could outpace any strategy the Quarren had relied on for centuries. Another officer, Kestera, a strategist known for her sharp mind, spoke up with a question. Admiral, do you believe humanity's success in the simulation is indicative of their approach to real combat? If so, then what steps must we take? Renar took a deep breath and answered slowly. The simulation was a window into their future. Their minds are capable of creating new tactics that will confound us if we are not careful. We must begin studying their history, their psychology, and their culture to understand how they think. We cannot rely on our traditional methods. We need to learn to think like they do, or we will lose. The officers nodded solemnly, and the Admiral could see the resolve in their eyes. But he also saw the fear. They had been trained for war, but nothing had prepared them for this kind of challenge. Humanity was not just a potential enemy, they were a force that could rewrite the rules of engagement, and Renard knew that it was only a matter of time before the rest of the galaxy would begin to realize the same thing. The future was unfolding, and the Quarren had to choose how they would face it. Days passed as the Quarren fleet scrambled to analyze every bit of data on humanity's unexpected tactical brilliance. But the more they discovered, the more questions arose. What Renard had initially thought to be an isolated incident was proving to be a harbinger of something far larger. He couldn't stop thinking about the child and the natural instincts displayed in that simulation. There was no training, no rigid doctrine, just raw intuition and brilliance. He watched the reports come in from other human simulations, and the results were the same, though less refined. The same patterns emerged, the same unforeseen strategies had been developed. It was clear now that humanity was on the verge of a revolution in warfare, and Renard couldn't shake the realization that they were moving towards something inevitable, something that would force the hand of every empire in the galaxy. His fleet had long relied on tactical superiority, advanced technology, and the ability to anticipate enemy moves, but humanity was not predictable, and that was their greatest strength. Renard called for another meeting. His officers gathered once again, their faces grim as they took their seats in the dimly lit room. There was no longer any discussion about whether humanity was a threat. The only question now was how far humanity's ingenuity would go and how fast they could adapt to meet it. The Admiral wasted no time with pleasantries this time. He spoke immediately. The child's performance was not an anomaly. It is only a glimpse into what is to come. Therak, the warrior from the previous meeting, leaned forward, his brow furrowed. Then we are faced with a species that could outthink us. But are they really capable of fighting beyond simulations? Admiral, do you think they are prepared for the realities of war? Renard paused, considering the question. The truth was that humanity's adaptability was undeniable, but he wasn't yet convinced they could take their virtual victories into the real world. They had no large fleets, no advanced weaponry, not yet at least. But that didn't mean they weren't on the brink of developing something. Renard stood still for a moment as the officers waited for his answer. Their fate was tied to his decision. The difference between simulations and real combat is immense, but we cannot underestimate what the humans could accomplish. Once they have the resources, they will adapt to any situation with the same creativity. We saw in that child they have the ability to learn from their mistakes in ways we haven't even considered, and that makes them dangerous. The room was silent for a moment as the officers absorbed his words. Castera spoke again, her voice sharp. If we acknowledge that humanity is evolving rapidly, then we must take action now, not later. We cannot afford to be caught unaware when they rise and challenge us. Renard nodded gravely. She was right. He had been hesitating to make any moves, but the time for waiting was over. Humanity was learning faster than any species had a right to. He looked around the room at the faces of his most trusted officers. The challenge had been set, and it was no longer a matter of if they would face humanity, but when. We will begin monitoring their progress more closely and prepare the fleet for all contingencies. We cannot afford to underestimate them again. Humanity's evolution has already begun, and we need to be ready for the new kind of war they will bring. Therak slammed his fist on the table. We will not be caught unprepared again. Renard nodded, acknowledging the warrior's determination, but inside his mind, a darker thought lingered. Humanity's ingenuity was more dangerous than any weapon the Quarren had ever known. It wasn't just their strength or their numbers that could threaten them. It was the way their minds worked, the way they would adapt and change to every challenge thrown at them. And Renard couldn't help but feel that the galaxy had already entered a new age, a new kind of war, one that the Quarren weren't ready for. It was only a matter of time before humanity would reveal their full potential, and Renard knew that when that moment came, it would be unlike anything they had ever faced before. The following weeks blurred together as Renard's focus remained locked on humanity's every move. The fleet had been tasked with compiling every scrap of data on the human species, analyzing their history, their psychology, their behavior, and for the first time in a long time, Renar felt as though his people were not the ones in control. Humanity's growth was rapid, far too rapid for the Corin's traditional methods of warfare to keep pace. Each new report revealed something new about the humans, and the deeper they dug, the more dangerous humanity appeared. Renar spent his nights reviewing combat simulations and studying human history, comparing ancient battles to the tactics the child had employed in the simulation. The more he examined it, the more the similarities became clear. Humanity had been born into conflict. Their history was a tapestry of wars of all sizes and scopes, and from each of those wars they had learned and adapted. The child's instincts had been honed by thousands of years of conflict woven into the very DNA of the species. But even this was not enough to explain the child's brilliance. What unnerved Renar most was that the child's strategic thinking was not just a product of their history or experiences. It was as though the child's mind had evolved to understand the art of war on a level that no other species had ever known. Humans didn't just learn from their mistakes, they anticipated the mistakes. Before they happened, they seemed to live in the future, not the present, and that made them a terrifying unknown. One evening, as Renar walked through the quiet halls of the command center, he found himself thinking about the child again, and about the potential threat humanity posed. The reports had started to arrive from other sectors, confirming that human forces were beginning to expand rapidly. They were adapting faster than anyone had predicted. The simulations now included larger fleets with more advanced ships and tactics that resembled nothing of their previous conflicts. The humans were learning to wield not only their own strengths, but also the weaknesses of their enemies. He stopped at the observation deck and gazed out at the stars. The endless sea of black stretched out before him, and for the first time in his life, the vastness of space felt smaller than it ever had before. The Corin had always believed in their own superiority, but now he saw it as a fragile thing, a bubble in an unforgiving universe, one that could easily be punctured by a race with the potential to evolve faster than they could respond. The door behind him slid open, and Kestera entered, her face as unreadable as ever. Admiral, the latest reports are in. Humanity has expanded their fleet by nearly 40% in the last month. The speed of their growth is unlike anything we've seen from any other species, and their tactics are improving at an alarming rate. They've also begun forging alliances with smaller systems. Renar didn't turn to face her, but his voice was steady. We cannot afford to let them form alliances. If they begin to unite under a common cause, they will become stronger than we could ever anticipate. Kestera was silent for a moment before speaking again. And what do we do when they are no longer just a threat on the simulation screen, but a real enemy ready to face us head-on? Renar's thoughts were already spiraling into worst-case scenarios. The reports from the simulations had been a warning, but humanity's growing alliances meant they were now a force in the galaxy, not to be ignored. Their adaptability had created a new kind of warfare, and Renar couldn't help but wonder if the Corin were on the cusp of becoming obsolete. They will not be ignored, Kestera, but the time has come for us to prepare for a new kind of war, a war we are not ready for yet, but one we will face regardless. The stars outside seemed colder now, the darkness deeper. The future had changed without them even realizing it, and Renar knew that the only question now was how long they had before humanity was ready to strike. The next few months passed in a blur of tension as the Corin fleet scrambled to keep up with humanity's rapid progress. Renar felt the weight of his decisions growing heavier with each passing day. While his officers worked tirelessly to adapt their strategies, the humans continued to innovate at an unprecedented rate. New alliances were formed, and their fleets swelled with each passing week. And still the reports were unsettling. Their tactics were unpredictable, fluid, and adaptive in ways the Corin had never encountered before. It was as if every decision made by humanity's commanders was designed to confound and outmaneuver them. Renar stood before his war council, watching the latest data on humanity's movements flicker across the screens. The child from the simulation had been the first spark, but it was clear now that the brilliance was not isolated. It had become a pattern, one that was spreading through humanity's military ranks faster than any other species' evolution of tactics ever had. And as the months wore on, that pattern became even more apparent. Humanity was no longer just a threat in simulations. They were a rising power across the galaxy. Admiral, the human fleet has expanded its presence in the Theta Quadrant. Castura reported, her voice low and serious. Their ships are using unconventional formations to outmaneuver our patrols. They seem to anticipate our movements. Before we make them, we have lost contact with several of our outlying posts. Renar's mind raced as he processed the information. The human fleet was no longer just defending itself or probing for weaknesses. They were actively testing the Quarren's defenses and pushing further into contested space. The enemy was evolving faster than they had prepared for, and every move they made forced the Quarren to react without fully understanding their strategy. "We've underestimated them again," he muttered under his breath. "Their ability to learn from each encounter is staggering." "What do we do now, Sir?" Theric asked, his voice filled with both curiosity and caution. Renar turned to face the table, his eyes narrowing as he took in the officers gathered around him. "We don't fight them the way we fought before. We need to stop thinking in terms of conventional warfare. Humanity is teaching us that traditional strategies are useless against them. We need to learn from their methods, adapt as they have, or we will fall." There was a brief silence before Castura spoke again. "Admiral, we've spent months preparing for every possible outcome, but humanity is rewriting the rulebook faster than we can study it. What happens if we can't keep up?" Renar's gaze hardened. Humanity's ability to innovate was their greatest strength and their most dangerous quality, but he refused to let fear dictate his next move. Humanity would force them to evolve just as they had done for every other species that came before them. "If we cannot keep up, then we must make sure they cannot move forward unchecked," Renar said firmly. "They are learning faster than we ever anticipated, but so are we. We will study every battle, every skirmish, until we understand them. We will become a mirror of their creativity. We will use their strength against them." Theric stood up, his posture straight as a line. "They will not beat us on the battlefield. We will show them what happens when they underestimate the Quarren." Renar nodded slowly. "We are not beaten yet, but we must change the way we fight. It's time to adapt or risk being left behind." The stars outside the observation room window felt even further out of reach than they ever had before. The future of the galaxy hung in the balance, and Renar knew that if the Quarren were to survive this new era of war, they would have to reinvent themselves completely. It was no longer about outnumbering or outgunning an enemy. It was about staying one step ahead of a species that seemed to know how to think their way through any challenge. Humanity was no longer just a rising power. They were a force to be reckoned with, and Renar could feel the pressure building as he prepared for the storm that was about to break. The tension in the Quarren fleet reached a breaking point as humanity's influence continued to spread. Their ships no longer simply defended but launched targeted strikes against key Quarren installations across the galaxy. Their tactics were relentless, fluid, and precise, as if they had studied every move the Quarren had made and found a way to turn it against them. Renar stood in the command center, his eyes fixed on the screens as they flashed with updates on the latest human maneuvers. Humanity had become a force that could not be ignored, and their brilliance had forced the Quarren to adapt or perish. The day had finally come when Renar knew the Quarren would have to face humanity head-on. It was no longer about skirmishes or simulations. It was a full-scale confrontation. The reports were in, and the human fleet had gathered at the edge of Quarren-controlled space. Their tactics would be unlike anything the Quarren had ever faced before, but this time Renar was ready. His officers stood by his side in the war room, the final plans laid out before them, their faces grim but resolute. Castura looked to Renar and spoke. "Admiral, we've studied everything. The humans have made mistakes. They are still learning, but we cannot underestimate them again." Renar nodded. "We've learned from them too. Their strategies are unpredictable, but they are not flawless, and we will find a way to exploit their weaknesses. The time for hesitation is over. It's time to engage and show humanity that their brilliance can only take them so far." The Quarren fleet moved out in full force, their ships cutting through the stars like a great wall of steel and fire. The human fleet was waiting just beyond the border. At first, the two forces circled one another, sizing each other up. It was the first true test of Renar's belief in humanity's evolution as a species, and whether the Quarren could truly adapt to face them. Then the battle began. The humans moved swiftly with purpose, their ships darting across the battlefield in formations that were completely foreign to the Quarren fleet. Their precision was flawless, and their unpredictability made them a difficult target to hit. Each move felt like they were anticipating the Quarren's next step before it was even made. But Renar had learned the value of flexibility, and he used that knowledge to his advantage. He didn't react to the humans' tactics. He forced them to adapt to him. The Quarren fleet shifted its strategy mid-battle, using decoys and misdirection to confuse the human forces. But the humans responded faster than expected. They anticipated his moves with a speed and accuracy that Renar had not anticipated. The battle raged on for hours, but slowly the Quarren fleet began to gain the upper hand. Humanity had not been prepared for the intensity of the assault, nor the sheer weight of the Quarren's experience. Their ships began to falter as the Quarren employed strategies that pushed the humans into uncharted territory. Just when it seemed that the tide was turning, Renar received an unexpected transmission. It was a direct communication from the human fleet's flagship. The same child from the simulation had taken command. Admiral Renar, the voice on the other end, crackled through the comms, calm and confident. "We've been studying you for a long time. Just like you've been studying us, we understand now that you are not our enemy or simply a challenge, a test to make us stronger. We're ready to face you in a new kind of war, but not today, not this battle." Renar stared at the screen in disbelief. The child's words were eerily similar to the confidence he had seen in the simulations. Their voice was unshaken even in the midst of defeat, and it made Renar realize something profound. Humanity had already won. They had not just adapted to the war, they had already begun to redefine it on their own terms. Renar took a long breath and nodded to his officers. "Stand down," he said quietly. "We've just witnessed the future of warfare, and humanity has shown us that it is not just their tactics we must fear, it is their ability to change the very nature of the battle itself." The stars outside the window were no longer distant or cold. They were a reflection of the future that lay ahead, a future where humanity would no longer simply fight to survive. They would fight to reshape everything, and Renar understood at last the true nature of the challenge humanity presented. They were not just a threat to conquer, they were a force that would transform the galaxy forever.